Hello, and welcome back to Kids Book Club. Last week we read from the book, Who is Jane Goodall? And we learned about how she was when she was a kid and how she always loved animals, especially chimpanzees. So we are going to fast forward a little bit in the book and read about Jane some more. So years later, after Jane graduated from high school, she started a job as a secretary and then switched jobs and was working for a place that made documentary films. And then a friend of hers offered her a trip to Africa. So Jane was super excited, so she got a job as a waitress to save up money for the trip and moved to Kenya. So now we will read about when she was in Kenya looking for the chimpanzees. Jane couldn't always see chimps, so how did she know where to look? She knew the sounds that chimps make. Hearing certain cries tipped her off that chimps were in the area. Jane would pick out a spot and sit. She'd stay for hours, quietly waiting and watching. It's a lot like how she sat in the chicken coop and waited for the hen to lay an egg. Let's keep going. Some days she didn't see any chimps. Even so, she was sure they were watching her. Other days she saw many chimps. Sometimes a few large males would gather together. Sometimes she spotted a mother with her young. Sometimes she caught sight of bigger groups of males, females, and young chimps. The trouble was that the chimps were always so far off, and they never were doing anything very interesting. Jane hoped to spy on chimps playing together, or watch a mother caring for a baby chimp. Instead, all she saw were chimps searching for food. They'd climb up fig trees and pull off fruit. However, the minute Jane tried to move closer to them, the chimps would run away. How was she going to learn anything that mattered? Jane was discouraged by how little progress she was making with the chimps. Then, to make matters worse, she and her mother both got sick. Most likely, they had both come down with malaria. They had no medicine with them to treat the disease. Jane had been told that there was no malaria there, so she didn't take medicine along. Jane blamed herself for that. For 2 weeks, Jane and her mother never left their tent. All they did was lie in bed and sweat. For many days, Jane's mother's fever rose as high as 105 degrees. Both Jane and her mother were lucky. They recovered. The minute Jane felt well enough, she returned to the forest. At last, her patience paid off. It was October. Jane's mother had gone home to England, and Jane was on her own. She began exploring the area she called the Peak. Every day, rain or shine, she climbed up the steep slope of the peak into the forest. Little by little, the chimps became used to Jane watching them. One day, she saw a female hold out her hand to a male, who kissed it. she saw two baby chimps play tug of war with a twig. Jane could tell many of the chimps apart, and she gave them names. Flo was an old female chimp. Jane liked Flo a lot. She was a very popular chimp, although, to Jane at least, Flo was funny looking. She had a big round nose and torn ears. Flo had a baby. Jane called her Fifi. She called Fifi's older brothers Fabin and Figgin. Flo was a caring mother. She protected Fifi from rain. She carefully groomed her. And Flo was a playful mother, but she was also firm. She never let her children get out of line. Ollie was Flo's friend. Ollie was also female. Her face was very long. Another chimp, a male, looked a lot like Ollie. Jane was quite sure he was Ollie's brother. She named him William. In animal studies, animals are usually given numbers, not names. In fact, many scientists think it's a bad idea to name animals that are being studied. They worry it will make the animals seem too human. Jane definitely did not think of the chimps as human, but she did see the chimps as individuals. In many ways, the chimps behaved like humans. Though unable to speak, they had their own means of communication. Jane learned to tell what their different grunts, pants, and screams meant. For example, chimps greeting one another with soft, panting grunts. A certain loud scream was a cry for help. Chimps, like humans, expressed feelings through gestures. They hugged and kissed one another. They bowed to show respect. They patted friends on the back for comfort. They also shook their fists or threw rocks to show anger. Do you think Jane had a favorite chimp? She did. Jane called him David Graybeard because of the silver hair around his chin. In one of her books, she wrote, "David Graybeard had the most beautiful eyes of them all." They somehow expressed his whole personality. He had a calm nature and was not afraid of Jane. He was the first chimp who seemed to accept her. One day, Jane held out a piece of fruit to David Graybeard. He came up to her, took the fruit, and then held her hand in his. How awesome would that be? David taught Jane a lot about chimpanzees. For a long time, scientists believed that chimpanzees were herbivores. Herbivores are animals that only eat fruits and vegetables. They don't eat meat. But one day, Jane saw David Graybeard and several other chimps in the upper tree branches. They were grouped around something. David Graybeard handed out pieces of the meat to others, and also let them bite off the meat themselves. So it turns out they're not herbivores. Through her binoculars, she would spot David Graybeard. One time, he was squatting down by a nest of termites. Termites are insects that chimps like to eat. Termite nests are like big mounds with a hole at the top. David Graybeard was poking a long blade of grass into the hole of the nest to fish out termites. He was using the blade of grass as a tool. It did a great job of supplying David Greybeard with tasty termites. Why was this so amazing, though? Well, up until 1960, scientists believed that humans were the only animal to be able to make tools. So, that must have been super interesting for Jane to see. So that's going to be it for today. Again, the book is called Who is Jane Goodall? And it does have a lot of other information in it too that I skipped over just for saving time. But if this story interests you, I highly recommend this book. You can order it through the library, but I will leave all of the information on this book in the description below. And we will see you next week with a new video. We will see you then.